great example of that is sort of emptying the dishwasher at home. You get into an argument with your partner or your spouse, and all of a sudden your whole Friday night's gone. Now, if I tap you on the shoulder 30 seconds into this discussion that you're having that's slowly escalating, and I'm like, hey, Larry, you're about to pour gas or water on this situation. What do you want to do? You'd be like, oh, water. No question, right? If I just jolt you out of that moment, then you're going to realize that you want to make this situation better, but you're making a decision in that moment to escalate. You just don't realize you're making a decision to escalate. And so when it comes to sort of clarity and tying this back, we can tie it back to something we said earlier, outcome over ego, right? There's three core elements to clear thinking. One is the position that you find yourself in. And that matters because often circumstances think for us. We don't really have a choice. And anybody who puts themselves in a bad position has no good options available. It doesn't matter how clearly you're thinking in that moment. So a lot of the work involved in a decision comes before the actual decision is made.
Welcome to the Bounce Podcast. I'm Larry Weeks. In the world of decision making, clarity is a critical element, if not the fundamental purpose. It reduces errors and facilitates confident, effective choice making. Good decision making isn't a product of collecting a lot of information. It also requires understanding, gained through experience and reflection. Further, knowledge or knowing isn't a static collection of facts. It's a dynamic process that comes alive when we face options and challenges and make choices. So in today's episode, my guest will shed some light on how to get clarity in decision making. And I'll add how to transform knowledge into wisdom. I'm talking today with Shane Parrish. Shane is a former cybersecurity expert at Canada's top intelligence agency turned thought leader. He is the mind behind Farnam Street, a site that's very popular among the innovator and investor class. And it draws on a variety of thinkers from Lao Tzu, Emerson, to Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. Shane is also the author of the bestselling series of books on mental models, and they are The Great Mental Models, Volumes 1, 2, and 3. And his brand new book, just released, is titled Clear Thinking, Turning Ordinary Moments into Extraordinary Results. And it is the topic of this podcast. So in this episode, we dive into the role of clarity in decision-making. We talk about the origin of Farnam Street, the influence of Berkshire Hathaway and Warren Buffett, the importance of defining deep understanding, the problem with living life on autopilot, recognizing the ego default and its role in clouded decision-making. Very interesting chat about the importance of pre-decision positioning. Very interesting to me, so listen for that. And an explanation of the learning loop, how to incorporate intuition in decision-making. This was very helpful for me and for those of you wondering, how do you put intuition into the puzzle pieces that make up a decision? Then we get into some of the mental models, like thinking in reverse or the power of inversion. We talk about framing a problem, separating problem identification from problem solving. So I believe you're really going to find this episode very insightful. I would open up a notepad or your notes app and take notes. It's incredibly useful. So without further ado, here's Shane. Shane, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Larry.
I was curious about the book because you cover a lot. You integrate psychology and heuristics and just a lot of information to kind of condense into a book. Is there a secret to that? You got any secret sauce to that kind of amalgamation?
Oh, this is going to suck. But the secret is just doing the work and reconciling all these different ideas in your head and sitting down and putting pen to paper and then throwing it away and then writing and rewriting and just going through it. And what you're really doing when you do that is you're reflecting on all the stuff that you've learned either through other people or your personal experience. And it's that act of reflection that gives you sort of like a compression. And this book is, Clear Thinking is a compression of about 15 years of my life, studying people who make decisions in the real world and trying to understand what they do differently, because it's not about spreadsheets and it's not about Excel formulas and it's not about these things that we tend to think of when we think of making better decisions. And so the act of writing this book, I wrote the book 3 times, and it was that process of writing that really allows for the synthesis and the compression of these ideas into something that's usable for you. And by creating this, I hope that it's useful for other people.
Yeah, writing is a revealer, isn't it? I find that I'll have an idea and I'll send it to my subscribers, but in the writing of the email, the idea is clarified for me.
I think people misunderstand that, like, when you're writing something, I mean, one of the benefits to writing something is that you actually realize you don't understand it as well as you think you do. And then that enables you to either go search for other information or to think about it more. And you often even generate new ideas when you're writing. And so there's so many advantages to writing, but the prime one for me is the act of reflection. You don't really learn stuff until you reflect on it. We think that we learn through experience, whether we have an experience from somebody else or we read a book, we talk, we have a conversation, we read an article. All of these are different types of inputs, and those inputs are experiences. And the quality of those inputs matter, but they don't really turn into learning without the reflection. And if you want to think of it, Tim Urban, I think, put it this way, which is the difference between a chef and a line cook. Like, we can both follow a recipe, but if something goes wrong, the chef knows why it went wrong. Why? Because they've reflected on the combination of ingredients. They've reflected on how heat and the chemical reactions in the food. So they know instantly what went wrong. Whereas me, an amateur chef, something goes wrong, I'm like, oh, the recipe sucked. I don't know why it went wrong. So often we have the illusion of knowledge. We use other people's knowledge and we pretend that it's ours. And, 80% of the time that works out really great. But it's only through the act of reflection that we're going to take that knowledge, we're going to chew on it, digest it, and as Montaigne said, make it our own.
I actually was going to mention, you wrote a great article, I think for Every, about the learning loop.
Yeah,
look it up.
That's what we call it. So the learning loop, you have a clock, and at 12 o'clock, you have an experience. And at 3 o'clock, you have a reflection. And at 6 o'clock, you have an abstraction or compression. And at 9 o'clock, you have an action. So you have an experience, you reflect on the experience, you create a compression in your head, and then you use that compression the next time you take action. And it's that loop and iterating on that loop and continuing to develop your understanding of these ideas that actually helps you put them into practice in the real world. But more importantly, it helps assimilate them into your own mind. And the little compressions are so useful, right? Like one compression I use all the time is like good direction or outcome over ego. And I just have these little statements that sort of encapsulate the ideas that I'm trying to live and trying to get better at, and that I've reflected on for a period of time.
I love outcome over ego. I wrote that down. I'm using that. This learning loop also, you made me, when I was reading about it, and you're talking about, it's not so much the experience, but the reflection on the experience. But still, for me, what stood out is that it makes all experience now way more valuable, everything. Because some people, they have an aversion to a bad experience or a failure or loss, but that's this fertilizer for better decisions in the future and or your knowledge generally.
Yeah, if you think of a failure, that's a high quality experience. So if you want to change your mindset around it, you get a lot of data from that. Often it's direct, it's emotional. You reflect on that and you get better. And that is the process by which we get better. But if you believe in the idea of a learning loop, then you also change your experiences. You want the highest quality inputs possible into your experiences. And that changes how you think about who you follow on Twitter and Instagram. It changes the books you read. It changes where you consume information. And so this one change, the change in your experiences, will change your reflections, which will change your abstractions or compressions, and that'll change your actions. And so you can think of this a lot differently, right? Like, it changes how you ask people questions. So instead of asking them, what should I do in this situation? You want to ask them reflection questions, because you want to take their experience and you want them to walk through their reflection with you. So you get a higher quality experience that you're having right now that you can use in the future. An example of that is sort of if you're a doctor and you need heart surgery and you ask them, who should you go see for heart surgery? Well, you haven't really learned anything when they recommend somebody. But if you ask them, how would you think about finding a doctor for heart surgery? What variables matter the most? And then they're going to start giving you information about, well, here's how I would think through that problem. So now you're using all of their experience to sort of like supercharge your learning and your experience. And I will say that this is a time consuming process. So you can't do this for everything. There's a certain percentage of information where you want to be the expert and you want to have the experience yourself and you want to go through this act of reflection, but you can't do that for everything in life. You can't be an expert at everything. So you have to pick and choose. I think where we get into trouble is we convince ourselves that consuming other people's abstractions, right? So our experience is their abstraction. It's the illusion of knowledge, and that gets us into trouble because we don't know that we don't really know. We don't know that we don't really understand as well as we should. And I think it's key to identify, hey, this is my best idea at the moment, but I'm open to changing that because I don't really understand this as well as I can, versus I'm an expert in this and I have a high degree of confidence in what I'm doing.
Sometimes it's a necessity to take shortcuts. So COVID, everything was changing in the field and on the ground every week because we didn't know what we didn't know. But in cases like that, you kind of have to weigh the risk reward kind of situation and look to pick experts to kind of say, okay, but to your point, be open, right? Don't lock down. Make sure you're open to the fluidity of the situation. But certainly, because your book actually talks about not staying on the surface and going deep, right? So that's extra important. There are certain situations when we have to kind of surf the information till we can deep dive.
Yeah. And what's important there is the ability to change your mind later. What happened during COVID was we got this narrative. We didn't know a lot. If you're going to panic, you do it at the beginning. If you're going to overreact, you always do it at the beginning. You never do it later. Right thing to do. But once we get that narrative in our head, we block off all other information. So when information started coming in that went counter to that narrative, it became misinformation or disinformation, and it was really hard to change people's narrative in light of incoming information. And part of that is because we're not really taught to think scientifically, where we update sort of like in a Bayesian way, we update what we're thinking as we get more information. Practically speaking, you want to think, hey, I have this idea. This is the best course of action for today, but I'm open to changing my mind tomorrow because I'm not 100% confident in this information. And I think the next time, based on how everything played out, people will think better about it because they'll be like, hey, last time we didn't really know. So maybe this is the approach for right now, but I'm really open to new information coming in that's going to change my mind about this situation.
And we're already headlong into your new book, Clear Thinking, Turning Ordinary Moments into Extraordinary Results. By the way, I love the tagline, Ordinary Moments into Extraordinary Results. And I think you talked to Annie Duke as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she really instilled in me the value of guessing. I always threw guessing away, like it means nothing, but guessing happens, every day in our lives. And I just never really paused to realize this ordinary moment of me guessing could be very informative, right? And kind of tuning into it. So I really like your tagline. And in the book, you talk about, the critical role of clarity in decision making and critical thinking. I think many of us are living on autopilot, which we have to get through the day, but are in some constant background state of ambiguity because we're not pausing to reflect on what we're doing while we're doing it or what we're about to do. And maybe at worst, tolerate some low-grade confusion or fog. You mentioned the problem with thinking badly or not thinking at all. And then the second part, it took me a while to think about it. How do you not think at all? And I think that's what it is. If we're on autopilot. And so it made me think of the importance of awareness. And awareness for me in the last 5 years have been a huge theme in my life. Do you think that's the first step toward clarity? Is the self-awareness? Because we just talked about being open and what have you. Kind of stop and assess our current situation. By the way, the book is helpful just by reading it and increasing metacognitive awareness, in my opinion. It's helping me think about my own thinking.
Maybe I can answer this in a few ways. So the first comment is, turning ordinary moments into extraordinary outcomes. And the reason that that's the subtitle of the book is so often we place an emphasis on these big decisions: who to marry, what career to have. The key point of that is that you're making a decision. And so you're thinking in a rational, or at least mostly rational way about that decision. And if you look at the books on decision making, they're all trying to teach you to be more rational, but they miss a couple elements that are really important and critical that I learned from other people that go into good decision making. So it doesn't matter if you pick the right partner for you. If you're an asshole, you're going to lose them. It doesn't matter that you pick the right career or the right job. If you don't show up and work your butt off, that one decision doesn't matter. But these other decisions, these little decisions, these tiny moments, these ordinary moments actually have the ability to multiply all of those big decisions. And so often we make mistakes in moments where we don't even realize we're making a decision. A great example of that is sort of emptying the dishwasher at home. You get into an argument with your partner or your spouse, and all of a sudden your whole Friday night's gone. Now, if I tap you on the shoulder 30 seconds into this discussion that you're having that's slowly escalating, and I'm like, hey, Larry, you're about to pour gas or water on this situation. What do you want to do? You'd be like, oh, water. No question, right? If I just jolt you out of that moment, then you're going to realize that you want to make this situation better, but you're making a decision in that moment to escalate. You just don't realize you're making a decision to escalate. And so when it comes to sort of clarity and tying this back, we can tie it back to something we said earlier: outcome over ego, right? It's hard to be clear on something if you're feeding your ego and you're focused on getting your ego satisfied and not the best outcome. Everything gets filtered through that lens. So you're not seeing clearly, you're distorted. And keep in mind, like, we're biological creatures, right? We're territorial, we're self-preserving, we're hierarchical, we're ritualistic. We have the defaults that I mentioned in the book, sort of emotion and ego, and we're social creatures. And so these things all lead to moments where we're not thinking clearly. And I want to tie this back to clear thinking. There's three core elements to clear thinking. One is the position that you find yourself in. And that matters because often circumstances think for us. We don't really have a choice. And anybody who puts themselves in a bad position has no good options available. It doesn't matter how clearly you're thinking in that moment. So a lot of the work involved in a decision comes before the actual decision is made. And that's one thing that I think most people miss. And if you look at the masters of decision making, sort of like the titans of decision making, people who consistently make above average decisions, one thing I discovered about these people is that they're almost never out of position. They're almost always properly positioned. And what that means is that every option available to them is good. If you put Warren Buffett in a bad position, he's going to make a bad decision. But he never puts himself in a bad position because he thinks about what position he's in at the moment that something's happening. The second element to clear thinking is sort of managing your defaults. You can't eliminate them. You can manage them, though, and you can get better at sort of not letting them impact you. And the third element is sort of thinking independently. You talked a little bit about this when you said, we're living life on autopilot. And too often we wake up at the end of life and we're like, oh man, I lived somebody else's life. I wasn't thinking for myself. And what do you need to think for yourself? You need to be in a good position, whether it's financial or health or relationships and friends and all of these things. And you need to manage your temperament or manage your emotions and your ego and be able to not let them derail you. And then that gives you the power to think independently and live your own life.
Shane, what was that first one? The position I'm in?
Yeah. So your positioning matters.
Your positioning matters. The US Open just concluded in New York. I'm a big tennis fan and tennis player. Roger Federer is retired, probably the greatest of all time or one of the greatest of all time tennis players. He was always in position, but it seemed like he was getting to balls that it would seem impossible to get to when somebody was hitting a ball to him or hitting it away from him, what have you. And it wasn't so much that he had this superhuman speed. He just had great anticipation. He was just always in a good position.
It matters a lot, right? And it matters in all aspects of life. So Federer was also a great example of somebody who could manage his emotions, right? So he bounced the ball the same number of times before a serve. And what's he doing in that? He's got a ritual around it. He's dampening down whatever happened before and focusing on what happens next. It doesn't matter if he made the worst play of his life or the best play. He's centering himself and getting ready for the next play. His position determines, and how I talk to my kids about this, which might resonate with some adults, is sort of like the position you're in determines the ease of the game you're playing. Are you playing on easy mode or are you playing on hard mode? And I think often when we're out of position, we're playing on hard mode. We're not consciously choosing to be out of position or play on hard mode. But if we over lever ourselves in terms of, how much house we buy and interest rates change, well, we're ill positioned for a change of environment. Could we anticipate that? I think reasonably we can anticipate that, right? We're adults. We have to be a little bit smarter than that. If you don't eat healthy, you're putting yourself at more risk because the position you're in when you go to the hospital or you inevitably get sick is worse than it should be. If you don't work out, if you're not healthy, if you don't invest in your relationships, it comes back to all these things that sort of lead to what we think of, or what I think of, as a meaningful life. And maybe other people do too. And how can I position myself so I'm never dependent on the kindness of strangers to do all the things that I want to do? I'm never dependent on the environment. And a great way to think about this is sort of, maybe this anecdote will help. My son came home one day with a terrible mark on one of his exams. Worst mark he's ever gotten to date. And he hands it to me, and he's a teenager, so he's in grade 7. And he hands it to me. He looks at me and he's like, I did the best I could. And he walked away. And I was like, okay, well, this isn't the moment to talk to him about this. But I want to talk to him about what it means to do the best I could, because this is so often how we think of doing the best we can and the position that we're in. We show up to a meeting ill prepared and we do the best we can in that meeting. But the best we can is actually the position you're in before you show up at that meeting. So when we talked later that night, I was like, well, what does it mean to do the best you can? And what he was thinking of doing the best he can, he was like, at 10 a.m. when I sat down to write the test, I completely focused on it and I did the best I could in that moment. And I worked hard for 60 minutes. I handed my test in and I got a bad mark. And I'm like, oh, that's really interesting, right? Like there's an element of that goes into the best you can. But what position were you in at 10 a.m. when you sat down to write that test? Did you sleep the night before? Did you get into a fight with your brother? Did you have a healthy breakfast? Did you study in the preceding days leading up to this? Did you study properly? Were you prepared for this moment? Did you put yourself in the best position possible to be successful? And the answer was no, right? He had a terrible breakfast. He went to bed late, got into a fight with his brother literally that morning. And he half-assed his studying going into it. And I'm like, well, then you didn't do the best you could. You chose to play on hard mode and then you got your butt kicked. The test was better than you that day. That sucks. But what can we learn from this and how can we apply that going forward? Well, the position that you're in at the moment you get to school and sit down to write a test is 100% controllable by you.
So should I not only look at decisions from the perspective of what position will that put me in, where further decisions or decisions after that fact will be affected, but also checking in with myself to see what position I'm in now?
100%. So there's a couple of points to this. One, there's always something you can do to improve your position for tomorrow. There's always something you can do today to make tomorrow better or easier. Nobody thinks in terms of, hopefully this book changes it, and everybody starts to think in terms of what position they're in at the moment they make a decision. We think of decision-making as being rational in that moment. But again, going back to something we said earlier, even the smartest people in the world are going to make terrible decisions if the situation is thinking for them. And the situation thinking for you is another way to say you're out of position. You're forced into a bad circumstance. So you can think of it as the greatest aid to your judgment is being properly positioned going into the moment you make a decision, or going into whatever moment you're trying to be exceptional at, whether it's a presentation that you're giving to the board of directors, or you want to come home? And what position are you in when you walk in that door and the kids run up to you and your partner comes over to you? Are you in the right mindset to be there? You might have had a bad day. Yeah, you're poorly positioned. What's likely to happen if you're poorly positioned? So you need a ritual to get out of that before you walk in that door. You need to metaphorically leave all that baggage on that doorstep, walk in that door and put it aside. So you're properly positioned for that moment, that circumstance. And you don't come in and your kid sort of grabs you and you get angry all of a sudden and you're just derailed.
So I had a work situation. I was doing a project. It kept going sideways. I wasn't connecting with the project leader, and I've tried multiple times, and I'd find myself in turmoil over this. I remember talking to a coach, but I was thinking about leaving. So I was trying to make the decision, well, I just end the project. And what came out of the conversation was I decided, you know what? Let me wait till I'm not in turmoil to make that decision. Let me get into a good headspace. Like, let me feel good just generally. I was sleeping and everything. It was just emotional, it was psychological. So just let me see when I'm at peace, just generally, and then look at this decision and make it. And I remember after I exhausted all the efforts, I came to a point of peace about the situation, and because I did my best. And it was absolutely, I should leave. It was for me, the decision was clear and I felt good about it. I wasn't confused. Prior, when I was in turmoil, I was like, I don't know what's the right thing. You know what I mean? And I had to wait till I was in this mental state in a better position. And not only could I make the decision, but I made it confidently.
So think about that, right? What's happening when you're emotional, whether it's fear, anger, you're upset, you're not going to make the best decisions possible. But when you're clear, you're making a decision. You're being more rational. Right. So you've instantly improved your ability to be rational just based on the position you're in. And so all these decision-making books, which sort of explain, here's the, 6 tricks to be more rational. Those things work only when you realize that you're making a decision, only when your emotions and your ego are not in charge of what's happening. And when you're charged, when you're in a bad position to make a decision, you're not thinking as clearly as you should be or could be. And so you might have a 400 horsepower brain, but it's operating at 25 horsepower. And what you're trying to do is get the most amount of horsepower out of your brain as possible up to its maximum capability. And this is where people miss, right? So if I'm emotional, I don't even think half the time. Like if I'm angry, somebody slights me in a meeting at work. This happens all the time. I used to witness this when I worked at the intelligence agency. Somebody would just say a slightly passive aggressive comment. Another person would escalate. And before you know it, people are basically shouting at each other with personal insults. And nobody is making a decision in that moment. They're letting their emotions make the decision for you. And the key there is like, we're animals. Like, yes, this is true, right? If you infringe on my territory, I'm going to respond. That's a biological instinct that we all have embedded in us. But in that moment when I'm responding, I'm being instinctual. And what am I doing? I'm behaving like an animal. What do animals do? They react without reasoning. The cool thing about being human, and the reason that we're sort of like the apex animal, if you will, is that we can reason before we respond. And it's about finding situations and ways that we can reason better, but also putting ourselves in a better position to dampen the impact of all of those things and allow us to do what we do. Positioning is so key.
Yeah. And you talk about the enemies in your book of clear thinking on ego and emotion. Sometimes, we're flooded, to your point, and we get hypnotized or we're on autopilot. Is there any tips, tricks on, okay, I'm emotionally flooded, or is it just a matter of postponing?
There's a couple ways that I talk about this in the book, and I think the best one is probably safeguards. And you can think of safeguards as a means to prevent the situation from happening, to slow down the situation, or to just opt out of the situation no matter what the situation is. And I'll give you some different examples here. And we already talked about one, right? Ritual is a great example of how you can slow down and refocus. And we talked about that in sports in terms of Federer sort of bouncing the ball the same number of times before he served and centering himself. And they do it in basketball. They do it in every sport where you have to be at peak performance. They all have these rituals to do it. A lot of the CEOs I've dealt with also have rituals around, pausing before they speak, or making sure everybody's talked before they've talked, or just taking a breath before they respond. Prevention is a really important type of safeguard that we never think about. How can I prevent this situation from ever happening? How can I change my environment? Either creating an environment to allow me to do something. Like if you're always on your phone and that's distracting you from doing the work that you need to do, well, I want to prevent that problem from happening. Do I lock my screen? Do I put a timer on how long I can use these apps? Or do I leave my phone in a different room? I'm just preventing this situation or adding friction to it. Another is sort of, if you're trying to eat healthier and having junk food in your health is proving problematic, you can remove that. So you're not preventing yourself from eating unhealthy, but you're just making it hard. You're adding friction to doing that. But perhaps the one that resonates the most with people out of all the safeguards is these automatic rules for success. And this is when the best version of yourself decides what the worst version of yourself will do. And if you think about rules, it's so interesting, right? We're taught to follow them from a very early age. We don't question them, but we never think about how we can use rules to our advantage. So we can create our own rules that help us get the outcomes we want. So an example is like, let's say you want to lose weight and you want to eat healthier, and you find yourself out at dinner with your friends and you're celebrating this big milestone, whether it's your birthday or which is coming up, Larry, or somebody else's birthday. It doesn't matter. What happens is, you might eat a salad for dinner. Maybe you had one glass of wine and you're feeling pretty good about yourself. But then all of a sudden the desserts come out and you're put in this situation where you have to say not tonight. And if you say not tonight, you're relying on willpower. And eventually everybody loses the battle with willpower. It's just a matter of when. And you don't want to lose that battle. So your friends will tease you. You could say, hey, I'm trying to eat healthy. And your friends will be like, oh, you can do that tomorrow. Like tonight's a celebration. And it becomes really hard to get out of this situation. But what you can do is, before you even get there, when you decide that I want to eat healthier, you can create one or two automatic rules that you're going to follow no matter the situation. And those rules not only help you rewire your brain so that you don't let the social default decide for you. You decide before you put yourself in that situation. I'm not going to eat dessert. My rule is I don't eat dessert. My rule is every time I'm out at a restaurant, I order the healthiest salad I can find on the menu. Those two rules. I mean, you come up with your own rules. You have to decide on the direction you want to go and then what rules are going to get you to that direction. But if you're at that exact same situation we just talked about, and I've tried this with friends to see if it works. And I've said, my rule is I don't eat dessert. People instantly stop pushing back on you. It might even take like 2 times, but they dramatically reduce the social pressure for you to have dessert because we're taught to follow rules. And so what are the rules that I can create for myself that are going to put me in the best position possible for success? And these rules, right? They put you in a position for success regardless of the circumstances. And they allow you to master your circumstances and your situation rather than being mastered by your circumstance or situation. I'm not using willpower to decide what to do in that moment. I've already decided what I'm going to do. I'm just going to follow my rule. That is such a better way to approach these things. And you can think of rules in the most important areas of your life, right? You can think of them in terms of health and marriage and family and friends and education and career paths and aging. And you can come up with, what are the rules that I want to have around these situations? And what does that mean? Well, for your relationship, that might mean, or your marriage, that might mean that we have a weekly date night. Our rule is every Wednesday we go for a date. And it sounds so boring and people might make fun of you, but they won't question your rule. But it's really effective at getting what you want.
It's also a very good social sugar. If I want to leave a party early and I have a rule, when I exit the party, I can say, look, I got a rule. I'm in bed by 11. That's just my rule. It's helpful in people realizing it's not personal to them. You have your own frameworks and rules for living that you just don't want to violate, and they don't want.
And
they
then
don't want to violate them. Yeah.
your only job is to follow your rules, right?
I'm
And
on
be
the
consistent.
hook. I'm only on the hook for me. They're not on the hook, right?
Correct. It's not personal. I'm not choosing not to celebrate with you tonight because of your accomplishment. It's just my rule. I don't do it. I'm here. I'm supporting
and apply
you.
it to every. It applies to everybody, every party, every.
Yeah.
Right.
So here's an interesting thought experiment, right? Like imagine what you want to achieve and imagine what the person who achieves that does to achieve it, and then create rules for yourself to nudge your desired behavior into your default behavior.
You talk about in the book exemplars, people who exhibit good decision-making habits or frameworks or what have you. What makes Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger recurring characters on Farnam Street? You even named your blog and organization Farnam Street. That's the investment house, right?
So we talked about reflection being one of the keys to learning. So I wanted to learn about decision making. I was working at an intelligence agency, wanted to get better at making decisions. Nobody ever taught me how to make decisions. Maybe they've taught you, but nobody ever taught me. There's no class in university. There's no sort of like class in the real world called Decision Making 101. The closest thing I've found is sort of the course that we put together called Decision by Design. And I went back. At first, I followed everybody around in the organization. And I sat in on all these meetings that I wasn't supposed to be a part of. I was just quiet, sat against a wall. Nobody seemed to care too much, and watched how people made decisions. And then that wasn't enough. So I went back and I did an MBA, and I found my MBA pretty useless in a lot of ways. And while I was doing my MBA, one of the most useful things to come out of the MBA was sort of this rediscovery, if you will, of Charlie Munger through another student in my class. And I had known about Warren and Charlie because I had read The Warren Buffett Way, Roger Lowenstein's book, much earlier. So super familiar with Warren Buffett, but hadn't really taken the time to appreciate his thinking or studying. And I decided I was basically going to do the bare minimum possible in my MBA to get by and get good grades. And then I had all this extra time. And I used that time to read up on Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, and also Daniel Kahneman and a whole bunch of other sort of like luminaries around that time. And I created a website called 68131-1440.blogger.com. Now, don't go to that website because somebody else owns it. But to give you an idea of the connection to Farnam Street, 68131 is the zip code for Berkshire Hathaway, and 1440 is the unit number in Hewitt Plaza for Berkshire Hathaway. And why a series of numbers? A, it was never intended for anybody else. It was just intended for me. B, I wasn't allowed to have any public profile whatsoever working for an intelligence agency. I couldn't have LinkedIn or Facebook or a Twitter account or anything like this. Everything had to be completely anonymous. So I created this website, and this was my online reflection area where I'm connecting ideas. I'm playing around with ideas. I'm editing ideas. I'm mastering the best of what other people have already figured out around this subject. And then that grew into, I don't know how, but people started finding it and reading it and loving it. And the number one complaint I always got was, this URL is the worst URL ever. And I was like, well, it was never intended for you to read it. It was just intended for me. But I did end up sort of renaming the website Farnam Street as an homage to all of the things and the things that I continue to learn from Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger.
I don't know how long. I should have looked, Shane, to how long I've been a subscriber of your newsletter. But they're just a handful of newsletters or emails that I tend to make sure I read. Yours is one of them. They're really good. And you've written 3 books, am I right, on mental models? And you mentioned mental models and the importance of mental models in decision making or in your new book. And is there 1 or 2 mental models that, from a micro standpoint, that you think are more important than others when it comes to thinking clearly?
Yeah, I think there's a couple really. The most prominent one that comes to mind is sort of inversion. And a great example of inversion is you have to avoid losing before you can win. And if we tie that back to Warren Buffett, what's his rules on investing? Rule number 1, don't lose money. What's don't lose money? That's inversion. Rule number 2 is see rule number 1. If you look at the greatest NFL coach of all time, Bill Belichick for the New England Patriots, arguably the greatest. I don't know if anybody's listening is a sports fan, but his number one rule is you have to avoid losing before you can win the game. And what does it mean to avoid losing? It's don't fumble, don't make mental mistakes, don't put yourself in a bad position where you have to overcome. You're playing on hard mode. Great example with the kids. Again, if you think about what it means to be a friend, you have to avoid putting yourself in a bad situation. If you're unreliable, if you're untrustworthy, if you don't prepare, you're just choosing to play on hard mode. But what are we doing? We're inverting everything. And this isn't a new concept. The Stoics thought about this all the time, and they called it a premortem, which works like this, right? Think of a project you're sort of working on today. Fast forward 6 to 8 months in the future and ask yourself why it failed. What happened? So assume it failed and try to avoid the reasons that it failed. More practically speaking, if you want to apply inversion on a daily basis, it's sort of like what gets in the way of your focus? How can I turn that on or off? An example I talked about earlier was sort of like putting my phone in focus mode or putting it in a different room or putting time limits on things. And coming back to the key elements of life, right? Health, marriage, family, friends, education, career path, aging. What do we want to avoid in those moments? And you can think like, what would a bad partner in a relationship look like? And how do I avoid those behaviors? And then all of a sudden I'm going to be a better partner. And what does inversion really do is it just, again, ties back to positioning. It puts you in a better position, a slightly better position every day. If you think of like, I like relationships a lot because they're very practical. If you're in a bad position with your partner, it's like there's a patch of grass between you two and it's dry. And then any little spark is going to light that on fire. But if you water that every day, if you invert the situation, which is, what behaviors do I have to avoid for this patch of grass to be dry? I want it to be wet. I want to water the grass. I want to invest in the relationship. What happens when sparks hit watered grass? Nothing.
Yeah, inversion is great. You mentioned premortems. When I was at Google, I managed a team that it was in a unique situation because there was a new ad program that we were actually managing for their largest clients. We're talking about some of the biggest businesses and retailers in the world, but we were managing spend, their particular budgets in one particular use case for a while because we were optimizing. We're trying to scale this program. So I was scared to death because we had to write checks, right? If we overspent or did something wrong with their money. And we had teams across the world. So I did this whole pre-mortem kind of reverse engineering as to what could go wrong and why, right? Prior to all this. And it was very helpful, right? This just looking at what could go wrong and then putting in place, not waiting for the thing to go wrong, but putting in place proactively safeguards prior to anything. We thought of every scenario that could potentially happen and then trying to mitigate that up front. So very, very useful. You mentioned health, and we're talking about inversion and positioning. So I have a friend of mine who is on a health kick. He's joined a gym. He's like cutting back on carbs. He's doing all this. And we're talking. We go outside. He lights up a cigarette. I said, hang on a second. Everything you're doing going forward as to lose weight and be healthy, that's all fine and good, but you're making it harder for yourself. Instead of adding all these things to your diet or changing foods, just do this one thing. Just stop the smoking.
Yeah. Smoking is a great example too, right? And we're talking about decision making in a counterintuitive, but I think super helpful way here.
Instead of what you're doing, let me go to the gym, let me do this. What can you stop doing?
But let's look at smoking and go into a bit more nuance there in terms of the position you find yourself in. So you want to quit smoking because you know that that's bad for you and it's going to put your health in a bad position. But how do I quit smoking? Often you find people are scared of being successful quitting because it'll mean changing their peer group. It changes your position because it's really hard for somebody trying to quit smoking to be around their friends who are smoking. And that's often where things derail. So you have to change the position you're in to accommodate quitting smoking. And that position might mean seeing your friends only when they don't smoke, or changing your peer group, which is, what my parents ended up doing. They had been lifelong smokers. The only way they joined the military when they were like 17, the only way they could quit smoking, You can't quit smoking at that time in the military because everybody smoked. The only way they were able to quit was to get out of the military and stop hanging around their old friends who smoked. So the position they find themselves in, if you're trying to quit smoking and you find yourself around a group of smokers, you're using willpower. That's you could have an automatic rule, which is my rule is I don't smoke, and you tell everybody that, and they're not going to peer pressure you. But if you're addicted to something, you need more than just an automatic rule. You need to put yourself in a position where you don't have to use that rule. You don't have to use that willpower. And the way around that is, hey, this might mean I have to change my friends or how I interact with my friends or the time that I interact with my friends. And then that puts you in a position where you can be successful with the thing you want to do. Again, it comes down to direction. Am I getting closer to the destination that I want? And is that destination worth wanting? And if you think about those things in the position that you're in, you might realize, hey, I have to put myself in a different position to be successful with this.
Let's tee up a hypothetical decision I or somebody in the audience listening needs to make, or they're dealing with something they have to strategize around or decide what to do, or they've got options to buy. So do you have a framework for a good problem statement?
Well, one of the elements of the book, and this is really interesting, right? And counterintuitive again. One of the things we talk about in the book is the person who makes the decision has to determine the problem statement. Nobody else can determine the problem statement for them. They can input themselves. They can provide input. They can provide a different perspective. But ultimately, the person making the decision has to come up with their own problem statement. They're responsible for that because they're responsible for the decision. What tends to happen with individuals or organizations is, we sort of like get a loose idea of what the problem is, and then we run and we solve it. How many people have been to a meeting where, you go to the meeting and you're there to discuss a problem, somebody throws a problem on the table, it sounds reasonably correct, and all the type A people in the room start solving for that problem. But that's not really the problem at all. And that's why it's so key. Also, another idea we mentioned in the book is separating problem identification from problem resolution, having two separate meetings for these things and putting almost like a firewall in between them, so that you're not confusing these things. And what are we doing when we do these things, right? We're putting in safeguards. So having the person who makes the decision responsible and accountable for that decision is a form of a safeguard. They're going to take the process a lot more seriously, and they know they're on the hook for the decision, and they're going to ask for better input from the people there. Separating these meetings, that's a safeguard against solving the problem that isn't really the problem. It also allows people to go back and think about it, mull it over a little bit for those more introverted, for those who like to think and connect things in a different way. You're giving yourself a little bit of space in between problem identification and resolution. And everybody's like, oh, well, that'll slow things down. It actually speeds things up. I got to be honest. You can do this overnight. It doesn't have to be like this 10-day process. And sure, there's situations or emergencies where you have to make a decision on the spot. Those are different. But generally speaking, it doesn't slow it down. It speeds it up. And it also solves the actual problem more often than meetings when you're combining them. And so it's hard to pontificate in terms of like, here's a hypothetical decision, how you would think through it, when in reality, much of the work of decision making is, I need to take these ideas from this book and apply them to myself and this ecosystem that I'm operating in. And sometimes that's akin to taking an animal from the desert and chucking it in Antarctica. It's not going to survive. And you have to decide what ideas work for you. And the way to decide that is to read the book, reflect on the ideas. And that reflection is going to be like, how do I implement these in my specific environment, my specific context? Does this work for me? Do I believe it makes sense? And then if it doesn't, you just leave them in the book. And if it does, then you start applying them and reflecting on them and honing your skills around what works for you and what doesn't.
I'll harken back to what I mentioned earlier, as I think I know I can sometimes be in a low grade kind of fog or ambiguity around certain situations and not surfacing them to figure out what's rattling around in my head. So I was thinking, and I wrote down for myself as a starting point after reading your book, it was just a simple question to say, what am I not clear on now? and what decisions am I facing I need clarity on. Because sometimes for me, I'm just speaking for myself, so hopefully this is useful for somebody out there, but I am postponing decisions or some events in my life. Let's say I've developed a product and am I going to sell or not? And I don't know if I'm, something like that. I'm just making up something, but sometimes I will delay something, just let it kind of hang when I probably shouldn't. I guess I'm waiting for something to force me to make the decision.
So go back to that though. When you're waiting for something to force you to make the decision, often at that moment, you might find yourself out of position.
That's good.
Right. So you're making it harder for yourself by waiting and not being proactive. Proactive puts you in a better position. It doesn't mean you need to make the decision. It means, how can I put myself in a better position to make this decision?
That's what I thought, Shane. I thought, listen, it would help me tremendously just to put my ducks in a row. I don't have to make the decision, but I don't even have the ducks in a row. And it makes me aversive to it. It doesn't pull me into it. It drives me away because I don't have my ducks. But if I put my ducks in a row, it's like, okay, I know what this thing is as much as I can gather the information I have.
Your position determines the quality of your decision, the quality of your options. Better options, better decisions. Worse options, worse decisions.
So I want to ask you about intuition and maybe soft and hard forms of intelligence, because I talked to Andy Duke twice, great books. And you mentioned early on, I didn't say anything, but you mentioned spreadsheets and all this information, dashboarding, what have you. I do that, Jane. So I have, for big decisions, especially, I use spreadsheets. I have weightings, probabilities, you name it. And I think that's all very, very useful and helpful and should be done. But I'm curious as to what you think about this general intelligence. And we go back to the experiences we have in our lives. We have a lot of experiences. Obviously, the older you are, the more experiences you have. But, in the background of unawareness, in many cases, we get a feeling about something without specific pro-con evaluation. We get a gut feeling, this is bad or good, or you get kind of the spidey senses. Where does intuition and gut calls fall in your clarity frameworks?
I want to offer a few points before I get into that.
Sure.
Is when you're doing those spreadsheets, when you're doing what you just talked about, I'm not anti that. The real value of doing that is that you're thinking while you're doing it, you're reflecting, right? So going back to something we talked about earlier in terms of the learning loop and making decisions, you're conscious you're making a decision and you're reflecting on it. So you're likely to be more rational. The real value of a business plan for most entrepreneurs isn't the actual plan. It's the thinking that goes into creating the plan. It's the forcing function to make you think about the business plan. I'm a believer in intuition with caveats. Some of those caveats are, a lot of people think they have good intuition around business judgment. And if you're making repeated decisions that are very similar in a very similar environment with rapid feedback, those three things, you can develop and hone your intuition fairly quickly. If the feedback loop is long, the environment's changing, and you're not making the same type of decision over and over again, your ability to have confidence in that intuition is going to be impacted or limited. You might be overconfident.
A situation that's novel or
or not repeated, right? Or long feedback loops or multiple variables. Like intuition develops in a different way. So I am a believer that I talked to Diana Chapman about this on our podcast, and she spoke to three different types of intelligence. And the three different types were sort of your IQ, your EQ, and your BQ. So your intelligence, your emotional intelligence, your body. And what you're looking for is a whole body yes. You want all of those things to align. So if you want to put it in the context of this conversation, you want your intuition and rationality to align. You don't want to discount your intuition, but you also don't want to be impulsive and make decisions based on your intuition that have consequences that are hard to undo. So
it's alignment between maybe the rational and the emotional or the feeling aspect. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So okay. Like if you're at a grocery store and they don't have your favorite brand of oatmeal, you might go with your intuition and buy oatmeal, but the cost of undoing that is really low. But if you're making a decision at Google and it involves $100 million or lots of people and families, then relying on your intuition is probably not the best idea. You want to check that intuition, but you don't want to ignore that intuition. It's part of who we are. It's part of like being an animal. And often our intuition can point to things that we miss when we're being rational. And so there's a couple questions that I sort of ask myself when I think about intuition. One is the type of decision I'm making, does that lend itself towards more? If you think of a continuum between intuition and rationality, you have intuition on the left, rationality on the right. It's just this continuum. Where does the optimal sort of like focal point on that decision? If I'm making a financial decision, I want it to be almost all the way to the right. I don't want to make an impulsive or instinctual financial decision. I want that to be as rational as it can be. If I'm making a relationship decision about who to spend my life with, well, there's probably a bit of a mix between these, and I don't want to be as purely rational. There's an intuition, a feeling that I have about the chemistry and the person, and I don't want to discount that by being overly rational. And, maybe giving up on the best relationship I've ever had in my life because it's not 100% rational. And I think we need to account for that. And there's other ways to sort of think about where you are on that spectrum and how to incorporate intuition. Another way that I love to do this is I actually write out big decisions the night before I make them. So it's sort of like I make them in my head. I sort of like, I'm done with it.
I like that.
And I write it out on a piece of paper. And, going back to these little encapsulations or compressions of knowledge, I call it making the invisible visible. And what I'm doing when I write this decision down, I take it on a page of paper. I often burn them, I shred them. Nobody has to see them. I write them by hand and I write out the decision. And sometimes it's an instinctual decision and I write it out and I wake up in the morning and I read it. I read what I wrote about this decision that I'm making. And does it make sense? And does it align? Now I'm more in a rational mood. So like, does it align with that? And so I'm checking in with both my intuition and my rational mind. But I also want to know where on the continuum would the optimal sort of like decision be on this? You never probably want to be purely emotional and you never, rarely want to be purely rational. And you want a mix of those two things. And it's just sort of like, who am I as a person? If I'm more emotional, then trying to be rational is just a fight that I'm probably, I can't be completely rational, but can I be more rational? And that's how I can put myself in a better position. I can be more rational. And if I don't think of emotions and I think of everything as a spreadsheet, maybe that I need to be more intuitive when it comes to relationships or friends, or trust my intuition and trust my gut. Also, if you're making a lot of decisions on your intuition, you need to follow up with how did those decisions play out? And that's the importance of writing them down. What was the situation? What was the context? What information did I know? What information did I consider relevant? Give yourself that reflection to look back on and be like, to calibrate your intuition. Often what we've found when we've worked with companies and done this is that people make correct decisions, but they got lucky. They didn't identify the reason that decision would be correct. And so their intuition is speaking to something that maybe that they can't quite articulate, or maybe they're just, they think they're making a rational decision, but there's a lot of intuition to it because on a purely rational basis, they were wrong, but they got the outcome that they wanted.
Shane, that is great. I've heard the whole body yes quote before. Derek Shivers, he has what is it? Is it hell yes or hell no? I think it's attributed to him. But that type of answer, when it comes to a decision, it resonates with me, but it's like, the problem is this rational part of my, my brain is like, whoa. I don't trust myself a lot of times, right? I'm like, I've made enough mistakes, and I tend to be analytical anyway. But here's what you've given me is that I can have a hell yes the next day. Mm-hmm. In other words, I don't always have the hell yes or hell no immediately, but I can have it because when Derek says it, or when I hear other people talk about this whole body kind of or this emphatic feeling laden answer, it feels like it needs to be immediate. But for me, it doesn't. I've had the hell yes the next day or 24 hours or a few days later. Once I've tuned into what's going on in my feelings and also did a bit of, rational thinking, card counting or number counting. Anyway, I just wanted to put that out there.
This goes back to what we're talking about, right? So you have to take what works for other people I can only talk to what works for me. And then you have to make it your own and adjust it to you. If you're trying to be somebody you're not, you're fighting gravity. Like it's just a losing proposition.
And it's tempting. I want to be like that person, right?
Yeah. But instead of it being binary and saying that's the direction you want to go, I want to be more like this person. The question is, how do I become more like this person? Not how do I decide like this person?
Mm-hmm.
And this goes to another example in the book with your personal board of directors and your exemplars. And that allows you to sort of like assume the persona of this other person and look at whatever problem or decision that you're facing through their lens. And that allows you to eliminate blind spots. And if you think of decision making, all of our poor decisions come from a blind spot. And so if we change our perspective, we can reduce our blind spots.
Shane, this is so good. I can't recommend the book highly enough. And again, the book is Clear Thinking, Turning Ordinary Moments into Extraordinary Results. It should be out by the time this podcast is out, October 3rd, you said? Is that right?
Yeah. October 3rd.
Your podcast is called The Knowledge Project, and you talk a lot about on your blog reading and what have you. I'm just curious, before I let you go, is how do you read a book?
It's a great question. I mean, one thing I do that a lot of people don't do is I give up on books. I have no desire to read the whole book if it's not compelling me to read it. The second thing I do is I sort of skim it, right? And I spend, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes with a book. And then that 20 minutes is sort of like a minimal investment to decide if I want to read this book. There's a lot of books these days, and I tried not to write this one. So a lot of books where you read the introduction and you get all the ideas in the book in the introduction. And reading the book is sort of pointless, especially if you have familiarity with those ideas or you can connect them to things that you already know. And the book is just like examples and stories around those ideas, but you don't need all those examples if you already sort of understand the ideas. I tried to write a book where the further along you read, the more information you're accumulating and you're getting better. And there's still new ideas on page like 170 and 190. And the third thing that I do is then I just take notes. I have a conversation with the author. If I want to read the book, I like pull out a pen and I'm like, what does this mean? How can I connect this to what I'm reading? And then the fourth thing, if anything, is I sort of let time filter books for me, which is I rarely read newer books. I want things that are sort of going to stand the test of time, where knowledge accumulates, unless I'm looking for something specific, right? Most of the specific knowledge is actually on the internet because it's always changing. So if you're looking for a specific skill, you can often find that on YouTube or the internet. You don't need to read a book on it. What I want to read books on is like perspective, historical perspective, different perspective, things that stand the test of time. Because those books sort of, you can read them and then reread them and reread them. And if you think of the opportunity cost of reading a new book, it's the opportunity cost of that is reading the best book you've ever read before in your life. And it has quite a high opportunity cost.
So when you read, just to be clear, you're hooked or you've qualified that, okay, I've skimmed this. There's very useful information. I want to go deeper. You then read and you open a notebook and you actually take notes while you're reading? Or?
No, I write in the book. I mostly read, if I'm not preparing for a podcast or something, I mostly read on physical books. And those physical books, I just literally write in the margins. I'm like, here's my thinking. And often I'll go back and read them. And you can create a little index on the front page of the book. I often do a blank sheet approach, which we write about on the website, which is especially with subjects I don't know much about. I'll take out a blank sheet of paper and I'll do a mind map of like, what do I know about this subject? And that's before reading the book. And then as I read the book, I will add to that knowledge, that sheet. And then that sheet becomes this sort of like reference guide, not only to the book, but to my knowledge on it, where I'm connecting information, I'm erasing information. I'm sort of like building this mental scaffolding, if you will, from reading the book. And if you look up the blank sheet method, Farnam Street, you'll find a template, an example, and you'll sort of see what I mean when I talk about that.
Any new books that you're reading right now that you recommend?
No, I'm reading a really old book for like the 10th time called Men and Rubber, which was written in 1926 by Harvey Fierstein. And it's one of the best books I've ever read.
Men and Rubber. What's it about?
It's just about business. I mean, it's about starting a tire company and the lessons he learned from his father. And I mean, the language is a bit dated. So if you run out and buy it, you have to acknowledge that it was written in 1926. I used to own, I think, 10 or 15% of the world's supply of this book. So we actually sort of republished it on purpose because I was spending, $500 a copy to buy used copies and give them away to friends. And so since it's out of copyright, we went through it, we edited it a little bit, got rid of some typos and stuff. We didn't change the language at all or change the content of the book, packaged it up really nicely, made it look pretty, and put it out there so everybody can get it.
Men in Rubber.
Yeah.
By who?
Harvey Firestone Tire Company.
I'll have to check that out. Wow.
Yeah, it's really good. Really, really good.
Shane, I think this book should do well. Tell us outside of, the normal place people buy books, it's Farnam Street. Where do people find you? I mean, you're everywhere, but give us the appropriate locations.
You can go to fs.blog. You can sign up for our newsletter called Brain Food, which goes out to 600,000 people every week and just contains a lot of what we talked about today. Like, here are the little nuggets of information that I've got this week, and I'm going to share them with you. And you can go to Twitter, which is Shane A. Parrish, Parrish, or just Google Shane Parrish, and you'll find everything you need to find. And the book is called Clear Thinking, Turning Ordinary Moments into Extraordinary Outcomes. And let me know what you think. I'd love to hear what you think. One of my best friends texted me before we just got on today, and he's like, the advice on page 113 changed my life forever.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's great. And by the way, I just want to recommend your podcast too. And let me, if somebody's not familiar with you or your podcast, check out the interview with Naval Ravikant. Man, that is great. And I think you actually resurfaced it. I listened to it when he first came out. That was just an amazing interview, and I highly recommend that to everybody. Shane, thanks for coming on, man. Well, that's a wrap. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed it, do share it with your friends and on your social platforms. Big thanks to Sam Williams, my audio guy, and the beautiful bumper music you're hearing is Michael Petrovich's Bella Luna. For all my show notes or resource links, visit larryweeks.com, and we will talk again soon.